The coffee smelled like burnt cinnamon that morning. The kitchen window fogged where I had been leaning over the kettle. I remember the weight of the phone in my hand, Lily's voice small and bright on the other end. She told me about Guatemala, about a dusty lot and laughter that might fill it, about a little boy with a crooked smile who needed a roof. Then she said the number. 15,000. The words landed in my chest like a stone. I set the phone down and looked at Robert's picture on the mantel. His face seemed to glow in the lamplight. He always kept his cap beside the portrait, like he might walk out of it. When he was alive, he mopped floors at the church for extra hours, came home smelling of bleach and lemon. "Betty," he used to say, tapping his pipe, "we put a little aside for something that matters." His brooch, the tiny gold butterfly he gave me the first year we married, was pinned to the framed photo. I touched the glass and felt the chill of it under my fingertips. I couldn't sleep that night. The house was quiet except for the old heater's tick. I paced the living room and counted the envelopes on the desk, the savings Robert and I had tucked away after years of repairs and holidays for the kids. I thought of Lily's laugh, of the smell of church after a hymn, of the way children in pictures hold hands without worrying about money. I went to the bank at 9 a.m., the morning air sharp and blue against my skin. The bank felt like a different world. Cool linoleum underfoot, soft music I couldn't name, the faint metallic scent of coins in the teller's drawer. The manager was a man I'd known from church, Mr. Hayes, though we didn't always speak beyond the occasional nod. I asked quietly for a cashier's check, the paper smooth and heavy between my fingers. I wrote $12,000. I asked him, with a smile that trembled a little, to deliver it anonymously to the church. He glanced at me, adjusted his glasses. No questions. I folded the check into an envelope, and before I left I slipped the butterfly brooch into my palm, old habit like holding a rosary. It felt warm from my skin. When Lily called that afternoon, her voice was full of wonder. "It's done," she said. "They have the money, Grandma. They said it's a miracle." I put the brooch back on my dress, under the collar where it could not catch a drawstring or a hand. I didn't tell her who had paid. I had always believed the scripture. When you give, let not your left hand know what the right hand does. I didn't need the praise. I only wanted the orphanage to get built. For the first few weeks afterward, the church buzzed with speculation. People whispered by the coffee urn, a low hum under the hymnals. Some said a businessman had donated. Others suggested the pastor had pulled strings. I watched faces more than I joined conversations. Helen, with her perfect nails and the floral agenda folded like a little fort in her lap, began canceling our Wednesday teas. The Thompsons stopped inviting me to their after-service lunches. In prayer circle my seat felt colder. The brooch at my collar moved against the fabric like a heartbeat I wasn't sure belonged to me. The Saturday before the send-off, the sanctuary was stripped and then rebuilt with color. Paper banners painted children's faces, a flag or two from Guatemala. The morning light slanted through the stained glass and laid a blue cross across the hymnals. I sat in the third row, hand folded over my worn Bible. The leather was cracked and embossed with other people's fingerprints, each page edge softened by years of thumb. The air smelled of polished wood and lemon oil from the pews. Pastor Daniel's voice filled the room, steady, preacher strong. He spoke about giving, sacrifice, about the miracle that had made the trip possible. He adjusted his thin-framed glasses. They caught a shimmer of light and then hid the expression behind them. He reached into an envelope as if revealing treasure. "And now," he said, opening the paper deliberately, "it is with great joy that I announce our anonymous donor. Betty Wilson, could you please stand?" I felt the floor drop away and the hymnals tilt. My knees were a stubborn thing, suddenly cotton. The Bible shook in my hands. All at once every head turned toward me. I can tell you exactly how odd it felt. The scrape of a shoe, the murmur threaded through rows like a loose thread. Some smiles, some pursed lips, the sharpness of a few stares. Helen's jaw tightened. The Thompsons' table was empty-minded, their coffee cups still steaming on remembered trays. The pastor talked of the widow's mite. He praised me, profane and perfect praise, painting the image of a poor woman giving all. I realized he had chosen a story frame that didn't fit. I still had enough to live on. But that wasn't his point. The point was spectacle. I could see the rumor settling into faces like dust. Lily rose before I could, her shoulder blade tight beneath her shirt. She didn't shout, but the clarity of her voice cut the hush like a bell. My grandparents saved honestly, she said. My grandfather worked here, mopped, fixed, stayed late. He didn't have a big bank account, but they saved. He was good. Her hands trembled, a tiny insistence. People shifted. Pastor Daniel's mouth opened, closed. His eyes met mine for a heartbeat, surprised, perhaps, that a revelation would become accusation. I walked forward then. My steps were small and certain. The brooch warmed against my chest. I put my Bible on the pulpit, felt its familiar indents. I didn't give for applause, I said. My voice surprised me by being steady. I gave because those children need a home. If my giving makes anyone uncomfortable, I'm sorry, for the discomfort, not the deed. There was a silence heavy enough to catch a cough. Leaves from the maple outside tapped the glass like a slow metronome. I could hear the echo of my own breath. And then a rustle. Lily, my girls from the youth group, even Helen swallowing hard as if a lesson had just been placed in her hand. The sound carried me back out into the cool autumn air, where the streets smelled faintly of wet leaves and gasoline. I walked to the curb, the brooch cold again, and felt a hand slip into mine, Lily's, callous from packing and patched with glue from stickers. Behind us, footsteps followed, and for the first time that morning they weren't all the same. The silence that fell over the church sanctuary when Pastor Daniel announced my name was deafening. I could feel every stare fixed on me. Some astonished, others looking away fast. My hands began to tremble over the worn Bible I was holding. After 30 years in that community, that moment exposed everything I had suspected but refused to believe. The anonymous check I had written to fund the whole mission trip had just had its origin revealed, and the reactions around me spoke louder than any words. My loves, thank you for taking a few minutes to sit with me. I'm truly grateful. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber is like a breath of life toward our first goal of 1,000. If this story touches you, please click subscribe and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd love to know who's here with me. The kettle hissed like a small engine as I poured coffee into my favorite mug. It always smelled like burnt cinnamon, my mistake, sugar left too long in the pan. Yet somehow it felt like home. The morning light leaned through the kitchen window in thin bars, laying a stripe across Robert's picture on the mantel. His cap was still beside the frame, as if he might tip it and stand up to make a joke about the weather. I stroked the glass. The brooch he'd given me years ago rested under my fingers, warm from where I'd hidden it in my palm overnight. Sunday mornings have a rhythm you learn to follow. The church bell 2 blocks over tolled 7 times, soft and sure, and somewhere a child laughed high and bright. After 30 years, I knew who would be at which pew, which hymns Pastor Daniel would favor, and where Helen would sit holding her floral agenda like a talisman. That familiarity is a kind of prayer, a steadying thing when everything else shifts. Lily called before I left. Her voice was quick with hope and with worry. She talked about Guatemala as if she could already taste the dust and hear the children's laughter. She told me about the lot where they would build, about a crooked roof little building sketched on a whiteboard at youth group. Then she told me the number 15,000, and you could hear the breath she tried not to take in. I set the phone down, and the room seemed to tilt a little. I am 68. Widow. I have spent my life threading small mercies into the days of others. When Robert worked late at the church, mopping between services, fixing up that old furnace down in the basement, He smelled of bleach and lemon oil. I worked part-time at the Still, there are edges to that quiet. There are pews where people sit with their arms folded and faces pressed into a careful neutrality. There is an empty seat, the one Robert used to take, closer to the aisle. His jacket still hangs on the back of it on mornings I forget to bring it in. It is a small, sharp thing, that empty space. A reminder of what we lose and what we choose to carry. On Saturday I went to the bank. The lobby smelled of cleaner and paper and new pens. Mr. Hayes, the manager, greeted me like he always has, polite, eyes flicking to my hands as if to read the weather in them. I asked for a cashier's check. I asked for it to be delivered to the church anonymously. I folded the paper in my purse and felt the weight of it like a decision made solid. Robert would have nodded. He used to tap his pipe and say, "Betty, when it matters you'll know." I had taught myself to listen for those little taps in the silence. There are things in the sanctuary that speak before we start to speak. A small wooden cross sits on the altar, smoothed by years of palms. The curtain behind it is a deep blue this season, catching the light from the stained glass and throwing a soft, cool wash across the choir. A single candle flickers at the side, its wax gathered like the slow work of time. These objects look ordinary until you need them. Then they hold story. For days after I sent the check, I moved more quietly in the church. I'd arrive early and sit in the third row like I always did, Bible creased in my lap, the leather familiar in my hands. The pews smelled of lemon oil. The hymnals smelled faintly of dust and polished wood. People would say hello, but sometimes their voices sounded like they were in a hall far away. Helen's smile was a little tight. The Thompsons' table grew quieter. You notice small shifts, cups not refilled, invitations that stop arriving. Those small things mark the map of a changing place. Faith to me has always been about small acts stitched into a larger tapestry. It is the cup of water offered when hands tremble. It is the quiet blessing whispered into a child's hair. Real giving has always been private in my bones. I think of Jesus' words to give without trumpets. So when I lay that paper on the counter at the bank, I imagined roofs and beds and little hands finally free of cold. I imagined Lily's laugh in that dusty lot, the children's hair combed and their faces turning toward the sun. But even the gentlest gifts cast shadows. The church is a community, and communities have corners where whispers gather. I could feel it coming like a weather change. I didn't know then how loud the silence would become. How a name spoken from the pulpit could tilt everything I had come to expect from the people I had loved for decades. The moment Pastor Daniel said my name, the world in that sanctuary narrowed to a single long second. The envelope crinkled like dry leaves as he opened it. His thin framed glasses caught the morning light and hid whatever he was about to do behind a slit of reflection. I felt the blood leave my face before anyone spoke. My hands went cold against the leather of my Bible. The pages felt like they had been pressed for years under other people's fingers. I had been in this church for 30 years. I knew the cadence of sermons, the exact rasp in his voice when he wanted a line to land. But even knowing him and his habits, nothing prepared me for the hush that fell when he looked up and said, "Betty Wilson, would you stand?" My knees felt like they belonged to someone else. The pew was hard beneath me. The varnish had the faint scent of lemon oil. I remember thinking of Robert, how his jacket still hung by the aisle, how his cap sat on the mantel, and then I felt the room tilt. Every head turned. Some faces softened into smiles. Others turned away. I could see Helen's jaw tighten like a door catching. The Thompsons' mouths pursed around the rims of their coffee cups. It was as if the church itself inhaled and forgot how to exhale. My Bible shook. The brooch Robert had given me, pinned beneath my collar, felt like a small living thing pressing into my sternum. My throat closed into a knot that made the air taste like pennies. I tried to breathe slowly to count, but the counting slipped away. My pulse hammered in my ears, loud enough to drown out the drip of the candle and the faint choir rustle behind me. Pastor Daniel spoke of the widow's mite. He spoke about sacrifice with a preacher's flourish, as if telling a parable that needed no footnotes. He painted me in broad strokes, the poor widow giving all. I could see how easily his words framed the story the congregation had been hungry for, the tidy lesson, the moral tidy as a folded handkerchief. But I also heard the undertone in his voice, the part that turned kindness into spectacle. Whispers threaded through the pews like moth wings. How could she? Where did she get that much? I felt the weight of their questions pressing into my back. It wasn't only curiosity. It was doubt threaded with something colder. A suspicion that the widow's purse must have been pried open by wrong hands. Faces I had loved showed the shape of an accusation I hadn't known had been growing. My mind flashed back to the bank lobby, the slick paper of the cashier's check, Mr. Hayes folding the envelope and carrying it out with the quiet that kept my anonymity safe. I thought of Lily's voice on the phone, small and urgent, telling me about the dirt lot and the children who would sleep under a new roof. I thought of Robert tapping his pipe and saying, "Betty, you'll know when it matters." That memory steadied me like a hand at the small of my back. Lily stood before I did. She rose like a small animal hearing a wrong note, sudden and resolute. Her voice cut through the room, clear, young, and unafraid. "My grandparents saved honestly," she said. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. There was a clarity to her that made the room blink awake. She told the truth with the bluntness of love. "My grandfather mopped floors here, he worked late, they put aside what they could." She reminded them that kindness sometimes looks like thrift and patience. Pastor Daniel's face changed then. For the first time that morning I caught something like surprise in his eyes. He looked as if he had expected the applause of a parable, not the uncomfortable glare of scrutiny. I could see a shift, awareness sliding into regret. But the reveal had already done its work. The rumor had settled in like dust. I stood. My legs felt steady once I chose to move, as if the rightness of the step made its own balm. I placed my Bible on the pulpit and felt the wood under my palm, scuffed, familiar, the old grooves like a palm line. My voice surprised me by being firmer than I felt. "I didn't give for applause," I said. "I gave because children need a home. Because that's what we are called to do." The words came out small and clean. No sermon, no flourish, just the plain truth. There was a heaviness after that, as if the room had to decide whether to fill the space with words or with silence. The silence won. I felt the cool air of the sanctuary touch my skin as if it had its own opinion. I could taste the lemon oil on the pews, the faint burn of coffee, the metallic echo of a coin dropped into a plate months ago. My chest loosened a little. My hands stopped trembling. When I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, it felt like being exhaled back into the world. The street smelled of wet leaves and gasoline, ordinary and honest. Lily's hand slipped into mine, calloused, warm, smelling of glue and packing tape, and it steadied me. Behind us came footsteps, some young, some older, some hesitant. Helen's voice reached me, small and broken. "Let's have coffee, Betty. I want to learn." In that instant I understood what the day had really been about. It wasn't the money on the table. It was the test that money exposed, the choice of a community to trust or to doubt its own. I had to decide not whether I had given enough, but whether I would let their judgment change what I knew in my bones. I chose the truth. I chose the quiet work of love over the pull of shame. Sometimes the hardest missions start at home, in the pews where we confess and the faces we hope will stand with us. I stepped forward, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my feet were on the right path. The air outside the church bit at my cheeks like a reprimand. Lily's hand found mine without fuss, fingers warm and small against mine. Behind us, footsteps shuffled, some tentative, some quick. I could hear the scrape of a chair as someone rose, a whisper that died when it reached the curb. The maple leaves rustled like soft applause, or maybe like warning. "Grandma," Lily said, voice steady but low. She squeezed my hand. There was a new set of determination in her jaw. The same look Robert used to wear when he fixed the boiler, and her admission was a photograph I couldn't unsee. Helen at my kitchen table for potlucks, hands folding bulletin inserts, the little scuff on her shoe from the first time she met Robert. I remembered her laugh over lemon cookies. The memory made me want to measure her with kindness. "Let's," I said. My voice felt small, but it held. The coffee room smelled of burnt cinnamon and wax. My kettle, my mistake, suddenly magnified. We moved inside. Pastor Daniel stood by the refreshment table, his suit jacket slung over a chair as if he wanted to be closer to people than the pulpit allowed. He adjusted his glasses, habit, armor, then folded his hands in front of him like he was bracing for a wind. His blue eyes flicked to me and then away. I could see him counting what to say on fingers I could not see. "Betty," he began. The word came out careful. A sermon softened into conversation. I thought announcing it would encourage others. I wanted them to see. To be moved. He tapped the envelope in his breast pocket, perhaps the one he'd opened. The motion was small. He hoped it would look contrite, not performative. Lily's mouth tightened. "You don't get to make a spectacle out of people's lives, Pastor," she said. Her words were quiet, but they landed like stones. You could tell she had held them back as long as she had held her breath. You made people into a story instead of letting them be human. He flinched as if a hand had touched a bruise. "I didn't mean," he began, then stopped. His throat worked. He looked at his watch, perhaps to find where time had gone wrong. "I should have respected the donor's wishes. I should have been more careful." The confession came uneven, not quite the full apology, but it was something like a hinge opening. I watched his jaw, the way it clenched when he was thinking of committees, of sermon outlines. There was regret, yes, but also the practical worry of how to mend a community's seam when it had been pulled. "People whispered," I said. I folded my hands around my brooch under my collar without thinking, the metal warm against my ribs. "They speculated. Some stopped inviting me for lunch. I felt it where it counts, in the small silences." The minister's hand found a coffee cup as if for support. He set it down with a soft thud. "We failed you," he said finally. No flourish. No sermon cadence. Just the raw truth. I failed to protect the quiet. His voice had a tremor that could have been shame or fear of admitting he'd misread his flock. Outside the circle of us, the Thompsons walked by without stopping. Mr. Thompson kept his head forward, the movement of his jaw like he was chewing the words he refused to say. On the bench by the door, a young man from youth group, Marcus, murmured something and slipped his arm around Lily's shoulder. Small signals. Small allegiances. Helen reached for my hand across the table. Her fingers rested there and the manicure trembled. "I don't know when I started keeping score about who had more," she whispered. I am sorry, Betty. I missed the point." Her apology arrived like a late rain, but rain nonetheless. In it I saw a path home. There was humility in her voice, real, not rehearsed, and that cut through the fog that had been gathering for weeks. Lily's face softened a fraction. She let out a breath she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said, and it wasn't only to Helen. It was to anyone whose conscience was finally waking up. Some people came closer then. A few hands brushed mine, hesitant, as if testing the temperature of forgiveness. Others stood apart, quiet observers who were not yet ready to rearrange long-held opinions. The church had always been a map of neighborhoods, some streets merging quickly, others blocked by fences we build ourselves. I thought of Robert's jacket on the empty pew, the cap on the mantel. I thought of the cashier's check folded in my purse like a promise. All of it felt like threads being rewoven. Standing there with Helen's hand in mine and Lily's arm at my back, I felt how fragile and how strong a community could be. It required courage to admit wrongs, patience to be forgiven, and the stubborn work of returning to grace. Let's go slow, I told them. We'll start with coffee and old stories. We'll start with saying sorry out loud and meaning it. My voice was small but steady. The words were an invitation and a test, one I hoped we'd all accept. As we moved toward the parking lot, a few youth trailed behind, talking about packing boxes for Guatemala, about paint colors and bed frames. Their jokes were thin bandages, but they were moving forward. The autumn air felt less like a reprimand now and more like a cold hand that wakes you up. I breathed it in. The true work I knew would be back in the pews, behind smiles, in folded hands, in the quiet places where people choose to believe the good in each other. The mission, it turned out, wasn't only about building a roof in another country. It was about building a roof under which we could all stand without looking for cracks. The days after the announcement felt like walking through a room full of glass. Every footstep echoed. I would enter the fellowship hall expecting the usual chorus of hellos and the scrape of chairs, and instead the air folded inward. Conversations would pause mid-sentence, the last word swallowed, like the room had been caught doing something it ought not to. People who had hugged me for decades now offered a nod that barely grazed my shoulder. It started small. Helen stopped saving me a cup of tea at the women's meeting. The Thompsons' bench at coffee hour, always a place I could sit and talk about Robert's tomatoes or the hospital shift, sat empty more often than not. Once Mr. Thompson looked up as I approached, then his mouth closed around a greeting that never arrived. He shifted his paper cup an inch away from where my hand might reach the table. That inch felt like a canyon. At choir practice, the soprano section slid over without comment when I reached for the hymnal. The boys from youth group, kids I'd taught finger knitting and patience to, laughed too loudly at a joke and turned their faces away. Marcus, who always greeted me with a quick, cheerful "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," glanced down at his shoes and did not meet my eyes. His shoulder brushed past mine on the stairwell, and I felt the prickle of being an afterthought. Whispers live in pews like mice. They squeak at first soft and quick, then grow bolder. I would kneel in prayer and hear a thread of conversation lift and trail. Did you hear where the money came from? How did she even? Those fragments landed like pebbles on my back. The sanctuary that used to cradle my voice instead recorded every rumor and kept it for later. Doors closed that weren't meant to. The little side door we used for hymnbook handouts remained shut when I came by to help. Once I stood in the doorway to the nursery, the soft carpet smelling faintly of baby powder, and a volunteer muttered, too softly, about scheduling and sudden changes. She met my eyes only as long as necessary and then looked away. I thought of all the Sunday mornings I'd spent in that room, rocking babies whose mothers needed an extra hour of sleep. Now even the carpet seemed to learn to ignore me. Invitations thin like worn fabric. The Thompsons' potluck was suddenly family only. A women's luncheon I'd coordinated for years sent out its flyer with a list of guests. My name missing, though space remained at the table. The ministry sign-up sheet pinned to the bulletin board, the one I used to tuck my name beneath for communion setup, had my usual slot crossed out in a hurried pen. It was small, so small, and it said more than any sermon. People found reasons to be busy. I have an appointment, became a chorus. Meetings I once chaired shifted time and place in ways that made attending awkward. I would arrive and the room would ripple. A seam moved as if I were a draft. Even the children seemed to catch the current. In Sunday school, a little boy I'd given a lollipop to last year suddenly clung to his mother's leg when I knelt to say hello. The gossip had a geography. It gathered around the coffee urn first, then migrated to the foyer and settled into corners where older women folded bulletins. Whenever I passed, the chatter would flatten like a lid pressed down. Eyes would flick toward me, quick and calculating, and then look away before I could meet them. Sometimes I would see the shadow of a smile. Then the smile would fade. It was as if those faces were practicing neutrality, learning to hold it like a fence between us. At the grocery store, the young cashier who always called me ma'am, and slipped an extra coupon into my bag, counted my change more slowly than before, fingers deliberate. A woman from the congregation stood talking to someone by the produce. Some mornings I sat longer at the kitchen table, watching the kettle fog the window and listening to the tick of the old heater. I read the Bible the way one reads a map when lost, slowly looking for landmarks. Robert's words kept returning, tapping like a familiar rhythm. "Betty, when it matters, you'll know." I clung to those taps because they were steady when everything else shifted. They reminded me why I had folded that check and asked for it to be delivered quietly. The strange thing is how quickly familiarity can harden into estrangement. 30 years of Sundays and shared casseroles, and yet a single announcement had carved grooves where our togetherness used to be. I began to notice the patterns, the way people angled their purses away from me, the little coughs that started when I sat down, voices lowering as if I might catch something contagious besides their suspicion. And still there were small stubborn lights. Lily kept calling. A few young parents in the mission group offered a wave that was warmer than it needed to be. Mrs. Alvarez from the choir left a note in my mailbox thanking me for teaching her crochet one winter. Those gestures sat like tiny boats in a rough sea, keeping me afloat for a while. But the wall was building plank by plank. It creaked more each day. I could feel its shadow before I saw it. Avoidance at the potluck, a hymn sung too quickly, doors that closed just as I reached them. The community I had bent my life around was becoming a place of measured steps and guarded faces. And with each measured step away, my pulse quickened, not with fear of losing my savings, but with the ache of watching people I loved pull away like the tide going out, leaving behind the small stubborn stones of a life we had all built together. The room shrinks to the heartbeat in my throat. Pastor Daniel's hand trembles only a little as he slides the paper open. His glasses catch the stained glass light and throw a thin cross across the pulpit, and then his voice fills the sanctuary like a bell. It's loud, practiced, a preacher's cadence meant to lift hearts. "Betty Wilson, would you please stand?" My knees feel like river stones. I hadn't expected the sound of my own name to make the floor tilt. I can hear the hymnals settling, the rustle of a sleeve, little noises made enormous by the hush. My hands close over my Bible without thinking. The leather is warm and familiar under my palms, and I fold my fingers until my knuckles whiten. I breathe slow because I know if I don't the shaking will start. I count on my breath like a child counting steps. The scent of the sanctuary wraps around me. Lemon oil and old wood, candle wax and the faint ghost of coffee. It smells like every Sunday I have loved. Now the same air tastes like copper and glass. The pulpit's wood has the same grain. I ran my thumb along when Robert hummed under his breath and checked the boilers. That memory steadies me, a hand at the small of my back. Pastor Daniel's eyes meet mine for the barest second. He reads the lines he's prepared. He tells the story widow might sacrifice. The words are meant to sanctify. They land like stones. Some faces soften into that easy, pleased expression people wear when a story fits their idea of how things should be. Others go tight, lips pressed thin, shoulders pulled back like someone closing a door. I notice the tilt in Helen's chin, the gap at the Thompsons' table where laughter once lived. I should be invisible. That old notion I held, that our good deeds belong to God, is suddenly as fragile as the glass ornaments on the Christmas tree. A draft moves through the sanctuary like a secret. The candle near the altar gutters, its flame trembling. I see it sink and die in a blink. The tiny hiss of the wick is louder than anything else. The light goes and the room flexes inward. Somewhere a hinge catches and a side door gives a long thin creak, an ordinary sound, but in that moment it answers the hush like a judgment. My heart is loud enough to drown the creak. My hands tighten on the Bible until the leather creases under my fingers. I feel the brooch Robert gave me press into my sternum through the fabric of my dress. It is a small gold butterfly, worn smooth on the back, warm from where my palm has held it under my collar. I pinch it between my thumb and forefinger, something to hold that is mine. Whispers begin like distant wind. Then a current runs through the pews. Where did she get that much? Someone says. It is not a question. It is a thin knife. I remember the bank's cool light, Mr. Hayes folding the envelope, Lily's quick breath on the phone when she first heard the news. I remind myself quietly, this is not why I gave. The image of the children in Guatemala, little feet in dust, keeps my voice from breaking. Then Lily stands. She rises like a bell rung hard enough to wake everyone. Her voice slices clean across the room, young and steady and not willing to be gentle where truth needs saying. My grandparents saved honestly, she says. She does not shout. She does not plead. She speaks with a clarity that becomes an accusation of its own, telling the story not as spectacle but as fact. You can see it on faces, some soften into shame. Others look away as if truth has been too bright to bear. At that moment there is a tiny sound that feels like a rupture. A small wooden crucifix that sits near the edge of the pulpit, one Pastor Daniel keeps after visiting missions, tilts then slips. It falls with a soft thud against the hymnals and tumbles to my feet. The noise is ridiculous and absolute. Heads turn to the fallen cross and back to me, as if an invisible weight just dropped between us. My breath tightens. I can feel the congregation's attention like weather pressing against my skin. I stand careful and deliberate. My legs remember the path to the pulpit. Each step is measured. Each footfall makes the wood sing. I lay my Bible on the lectern and the thud of it feels like a verdict. For a wild second the whole world is the space between my hands and the pulpit's edge. I didn't do it for applause, I hear myself say. The words surprise me by being steady. They come small and plain and true. I gave because those children need a home. That's all. My voice is not a sermon. It is a statement of fact. There is no flourish, no need for drama. The truth sits there like a simple lamp. The silence waits on the other side of my sentence. The candle is out. The crucifix lies on its side like a question mark. The side door has stopped creaking. Someone's coffee cup rattles in the back and then stills. I breathe out a long time and feel the air move through me like forgiveness being offered or taken. In that pause things shift. Lily's hand finds mine at the edge of the pew. Helen blinks unreadable then swallows. Pastor Daniel's mouth opens and closes. His gaze drops as if humbled. The room inhales then slowly lets go. The names whispered in suspicion begin to lose their sharpness. The moment is not healed. No, nothing fixes in one breath. But the fracture has been revealed, and when truth cracks glass it lets light through the break. I step back from the pulpit and the wooden floor feels steadier under my soles. The brooch is warm against my chest, pulsing with the memory of a man who taught me to give when it mattered. Outside, the wind moves the maples and the world continues. Inside, we all learn how loud a single name can be, and how quietly we must answer it. The coffee cooled between my hands as if the cup held time itself. We sat in a small circle in the fellowship hall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of burnt cinnamon from my kettle still hanging in the air, and for a moment the world outside the windows looked like it might keep going without us. Inside, everything had to be put back together. Pastor Daniel stood by the refreshment table, his suit no longer immaculate, his glasses pushed up the bridge of his nose in that distracted way when a man is counting consequences instead of minutes. He cleared his throat and the sound was small in a room that had just learned how loud silence could be. I misused my position, he said. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't polished. It was a man trying to find his way through his own mistake. I thought naming the donor would inspire generosity. I didn't think of the harm. He looked at me like a man who had realized only then that his hands had been clumsy in a place that asks for careful touch. Lily's jaw was set. Helen's hands trembled on her floral agenda, like she was trying to fold the apology into something neat. Around us people shifted, some closer, some still holding their space. I heard the scrape of a chair as someone rose and then stopped. The moment felt like something you could lift and inspect. Messy, real, and necessary. You should have protected her privacy, Lily said. It was not dramatic. There was no grand forgiveness scene where every head bowed and harmony returned. What happened was quieter. People began to move toward one another like careful animals, testing whether the air had changed. Mrs. Alvarez from the choir knelt to smooth the tablecloth as if that small work could mean something. Marcus, a boy from youth group, who had always been a blur of nervous energy, came up and offered to help pack another box for Guatemala. The gesture was simple, but it built a bridge. Pastor Daniel did something practical then. An action I could see had come from his mind, not from a wish for redemption. He announced a new policy for the church. Donors' wishes would be protected. Names would not be announced without consent. We would make room for anonymous giving. He said it clumsily, stumbled through the words, but they landed. They were a small concrete repair. Helen surprised me by asking to come by my house. I want to hear stories, she said, voice soft. Not the kind you tell on a committee. The kind you tell over tea. That invitation felt like a key in a long-locked door. I said yes. We set a day for soup and lemon cookies and the kind of talking that doesn't keep score. The Thompsons did not show up the next Sunday for coffee. Some people, it turned out, had longer fences to take down. But other doors opened. A few families started to set tables with my name on the sign-up sheet. A young mom who had stayed away for weeks brought me a plate of banana bread, and a look that said she had been thinking and was sorry she had waited so long. Lily was steady through all of it, her quiet confidence like a backbone I could lean on. She watched faces as I couldn't, reading the small hesitations and the tiny hopeful shifts. At night, when the house hummed and the brooch warmed against my skin, we would sit at the kitchen table and plan small things. A dinner for the women's ministry, a teach-back on quiet giving for the youth group, a note tucked into the mission funds folder explaining why some gifts are anonymous. We made a little list of practicalities because sometimes righteousness needs maps. There was something deeper at work, too. The money I had sent to Guatemala had done what I'd hoped. It bought lumber, beds, and sunlight for kids who needed both. But that outward mission had forced an inward one. The church had to reckon with its tendency to make stories out of people, to fold them into parables instead of inviting them to sit at the table. That reckoning was messy and slow. It would not erase the weeks of cold shoulders or the way I had felt smaller walking through Fellowship Hall, but it offered a path. In the days after, small acts of restitution came, not by decree but by choice. People asked for help again in ways they had not before. Helen began saving me a cup of tea at meetings. Marcus started showing up at my house on Saturdays to help with odd jobs I could no longer do alone. Pastor Daniel took a flyer off the bulletin board and posted a note about anonymous giving. He came by once to sit on my porch and listen to stories about Robert, about the way he tightened a boiler or how he whistled while he worked. He listened like someone learning what it means to truly shepherd a flock. I did not forget. I did not forgive in a single breath. But I saw a change small enough to trust. The truth had been named. The consequence of naming it had to be dealt with. That is how a community mends, one ordinary admission, one small apology, one practical policy at a time. When I clasp my brooch now, it feels less like a secret and more like a promise. We will keep building, out there in Guatemala and here at home. The mission trip will go. The beds will be laid. The children will run their hands over new paint. And in our own small sanctuary, we will try, a little more carefully, to protect the quiet gifts between us. The days after the meeting felt like waking up slowly from a long fevered dream. Things were quieter in the house. No sudden knocks, fewer casseroles on the porch, but there was a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. Lily started coming by with a thermos of coffee and stories about packing boxes. Her laugh filled the kitchen in the same way sunlight fills a window pane, easy and honest. She would show me pictures on her phone of the mission team drilling holes and hauling lumber, Kids with paint on their elbows and the crooked roof orphanage beginning to look like shelter. The letter from Pastor Daniel arrived folded into three, the handwriting familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. He wrote that the mission had gone well, that the beds had been built, that children who had slept on mats now had wooden frames and blankets. He also wrote, quietly, that he'd started a policy about respecting donors' wishes. Names would not be announced without consent. He said he was sorry for the way he'd exposed what was meant to be private. The words were not a grand speech. They were a small mending stitch. It mattered. Helen came over one Wednesday afternoon, carrying a tin of lemon cookies like an offering. She sat at my kitchen table with her floral agenda folded back like a napkin and told me stories that were not about committees or appearances, but about the little things she'd noticed that made her pause. How Robert's jacket always smelled faintly of lemon oil, how I hummed when I ironed. She cried when she talked about that first cold shoulder, and how ashamed she felt for not noticing sooner. Her hands trembled when she reached across the table. The tremor was honest. I put my hand over hers. It was a small thing. It was enough. Not everyone returned. The Thompsons still sat on the far side of Fellowship Hall, their smiles polite and distant. Some doors remained closed, but other doors opened. Marcus from youth group began showing up on my porch at 9 a.m., toolbox in hand, ready to fix the loose step where my porch light hung. He listened when I told stories about Robert checking the furnace. He learned to make coffee the way I liked it, strong and a little bitter, and he stayed to peel potatoes for soup. Little Axe built new bridges. The mission photos were pinned to the bulletin board in the hallway. I would stand and study them. The sunlight in Guatemala different from our afternoon light, more merciless, painting everything a little sharper. A boy named Mateo grinned at the camera, a gap where a front tooth should be, sleeping under a bright blanket that smelled of new cotton. I had trouble at first looking at the faces without remembering the hush back home, the whispers. Now when I looked, I felt instead the weight of what had been done. The beds were there. The orphanage had a roof. The work I had done in secret had become visible, but not because of a name, because of human hands and open eyes. Sometimes at church I would arrive early and sit in the third row, the same pew I've sat in for 30 years. The varnish had a soft sheen. The lemon oil still lingered. The empty seat where Robert used to sit was just an empty seat, neither accusation nor shrine. There were Sundays when someone would slip into the bench beside me and reach out without ceremony. Helen did that a few times, her perfume faint and real. Marcus lumbered past with a paint-splattered shirt and a grin. Pastor Daniel stood at the pulpit and preached. His voice had new tremors in it, not from pride but from the humility of someone who had been taught. We learned to talk about the quiet things. At one of the women's meetings, instead of the usual agenda, we sat in a circle and shared memories of people who had shaped us. Helen told a story about Robert fixing the church heater in a blizzard. Someone else remembered the way I always tucked a hymn book under a child's arm before a song. It was ordinary and fierce, a reclaiming of intimacy. The community learned slowly to hold people rather than hold stories of people. At home I polished the little gold butterfly that Robert had given me, the brooch that had been a secret warmth under my collar for so long. It shone like a small sun in my palm. Lily braided my hair that evening, humming one of the old hymns. We sat on the porch and watched maple leaves tumble like small amber boats. The wind smelled of wet grass and something that hinted of winter coming. There are mornings I still go by the church and pause. The bench by the side door sits empty, varnish cool under my hand. I trace the grain with a fingertip and think of how quiet a place can be before it is full again. Sometimes I hear footsteps inside, childish laughter, the scrape of a chair. Then they recede and the building lets out a slow breath. The door clicks, a soft punctuation. On the day the mission team returned, we gathered in the parking lot under a sky so wide it seemed to hold every promise. People carried boxes and suitcases smelling of dust and paint. They hugged the children who had been on the trip and told the stories in bursts and fragments, like people who had learned too much at once. I stood back with Lily, our hands linked, and watched. When the crowd thinned and the last car left, I walked to the side entrance. The wind had picked up and it moved the maples like pages. I rose slowly, the wood creaking under me like an old friend. I took Lily's hand, and together we walked toward the parking lot where the maples had dropped a carpet of leaves. The wind nudged the church's steeple as if to remind us that the work continues, elsewhere and here. The bench stayed empty for a moment longer, holding the quiet between what had been and what might be. I folded my coat tighter against the cool and felt something simple and true. A door had closed, but my feet were moving. After all that, the days settled into a quieter rhythm. Morning still smelled of my burnt cinnamon coffee, and the kitchen window still fogged when I breathed on it. The brooch warmed under my collar the same way Robert's hand used to, a small steady heat against my sternum. Sometimes I would press my palm there and feel like I was holding two lives at once, the life I'd lived with him, and the life I'd chosen to keep private for their sakes. The mission photos stay pinned to the bulletin board by the back hallway. I look at them when no one's watching. Mateo grins with a gap-toothed honesty, his hair sticking up like he's just rolled out of bed. A little girl holds a paintbrush 3 sizes too big for her hand, chin streaked with blue. In those pictures the sun is harder than ours, and the colors are too sharp to be gentle. They make me glad and quiet, glad that the beds are there, quiet because no one needs to know who paid for the wood. Inside the church things changed in small stubborn ways. Pastor Daniel put up the note about donor privacy and said it out loud once in a sermon, awkward and sincere. He came by my porch one afternoon and listened to stories about Robert like he was learning the shape of my life instead of rehearsing how to tell it. Helen started saving me a cup of tea at the women's meetings again. She brought lemon cookies and sat until the last crumb was gone. She cried more easily now, and sometimes we would laugh about the trivial things. The way she'd wet her thumb to smooth a program, the terrible choir solos from years ago. Not everyone unlatched their fences. The Thompsons still sat across the hall most Sundays, polite as a painted gate. Some faces never softened. Some doors stayed closed. That was part of the truth too. Forgiveness doesn't come all at once, and belonging isn't a membership card you can hand back to someone on a whim. But there were new hands to hold, and that had weight. Young people surprised me. Marcus showed up on my porch with a toolbox and stayed long enough to learn how to tighten a step and slice potatoes for soup. He listened when I told him about the old boiler Robert swore he'd fix even in a blizzard. Lily came by with a thermos and a list of tasks, paint colors, bedsheets, kids' names memorized like a prayer. She is steady in a way that made me proud and relieved, like a beam placed just where a roof needs support. There were moments that felt like stitches being sewn. Awkward, uneven but binding. Pastor Daniel's apology was not heroic. It was small and human. Helen's tea and cookies were not a grand absolution. They were a reaching hand. The policy about anonymous giving was a practical fix, a paper mending a place where trust had been ripped. The mission itself, those nailed frames and patched roofs and the smell of new blankets, was proof that something good had happened even amid the hurt. At night I would sit on the porch and listen to the maples take their slow applause. I would run my thumb over the butterfly brooch until the gold warmed and the tiny clasp clicked. Sometimes I thought about the people who had whispered, the eyes that had slipped away, the small private hurts that pile up until they make a hill you can't climb. And I thought about the faces in Guatemala, how a bed can make a child fold into sleep differently, how a roof can change a day because it shelters the next. I don't say I was wrong to keep it secret. I don't say I'm entirely healed by the apologies and the policy changes. What I do know is that keeping that money in my pocket, then letting it go where it mattered, taught everyone something they'd been forgetting. Dignity often lives in quiet places, and charity almost always prefers shadow to spotlight. The church is still the church. Imperfect, noisy, full of people who love each other badly and try to do better. We are all rebuilding in our small ways, relearning how to trust without prying, how to celebrate without exposing, how to let good work be its own reward. Lily packs her bags for Guatemala next month. She says she's ready. I hold the brooch and imagine her under that hot sun, painting tiny hands, setting mattresses, making space where there was none. Some things end with loud confessions. This one ended in wooden beds and lemon cookies and a policy on a bulletin board. It ended with a few names softened and a few fences still standing. It ended with me remembering Robert's tap-tap on the pipe, an old rhythm that taught me when to act, and with Lily's steady breath beside mine. I kept a secret for a long time, and it became shelter. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.